Hey, and welcome back to EvoFem Tales, where the transformation isn't always what you expected, and the story goes deeper than you thought it would. Today, we're starting something a little different. No masquerade, no disguise, no choice in the matter. The Bloodline debt is the story of Julian Cross, 28, built, a civil engineer who takes up space like he was born to it. His mother died 6 months ago. There were things she wanted to tell him. She didn't get the chance. And now something is changing. Slowly. Quietly. In the shoulders of a shirt that used to fit perfectly, in boots that lace just a little tighter than they should, in a body that is, inch by inch, becoming something else, something it turns out his mother knew a great deal about. The world is rewriting itself around him, and he doesn't know yet. He just knows the shirt pulls wrong. Sit back, this one takes its time, and every minute of it earns what's coming. If you're already obsessed and need to read ahead, the full 13 chapters are waiting for you right now, completely free, over on our Patreon and Subscribestar. Links in the show notes. But for now, it's Monday morning. The alarm didn't go off, it never has to. Julian wakes at 6:15 like clockwork. He opens the wardrobe. Chapter 1, Wrong Shirt. Julian Cross woke at 6:15 without an alarm. He always did. 7 years of early sight starts had tuned his body clock the way you tune an instrument, not gently, but with enough repetition that the calibration eventually stuck. He lay on his back for a moment in the particular gray-blue of a winter Melbourne morning, ceiling above him, the sounds of a street coming awake filtering through the window. He always left an inch open, and then he got up. That was all. No deliberation. He was a man who got up. He showered in 3 minutes, brushed his teeth, walked to the wardrobe. His favorite work shirt was blue-gray chambray, washed to a softness that took 2 years to earn. He'd had it since his second year out of uni, and it had outlasted most things in his life with the patient reliability of good fabric. He pulled it off the hanger and shook it out and put it on. It pulled across the shoulders. Not dramatically, not a seam-stressing, button-straining pull. Just a subtle resistance at the join, like the shirt had been cut for someone whose frame sat slightly differently from his. He rolled his right shoulder. The fabric moved, settled, and then sat wrong again in a way he couldn't quite locate. He stood in front of the wardrobe mirror, a cheap full-length thing that came with the apartment, and leaned at a slight angle he'd never bothered to fix, and assessed himself. He looked fine. The shirt looked fine. He was just tired, or he'd slept on one side too long, or the wash cycle had done something to the weave. He'd been doing his own laundry for 6 months now, and he knew, with the resigned certainty of a man who had grown up with someone else doing it, that he was doing it wrong. He shrank things. He bleached colors. He kept meaning to Google the right temperatures. He kept meaning to ask someone. The thought crossed his mind, and he closed it before it could open properly. The specific shape of the gap where that someone would have been, the gap that was now 6 months old and mostly manageable, and on certain Monday mornings, apparently not. He tucked the shirt in. He moved on. His steel-toed work boots were at the door where he left them every night. He sat on the edge of the bed and laced them up and felt, obscurely, that the heel was slightly loose. Not dangerously. The boot wasn't going anywhere, just a faint give at the back with each flex that hadn't been there the week before. He laced them tighter. The sensation didn't quite disappear. He left anyway. He was going to be on a construction site. His boots were fine. The project was a traffic interchange in Melbourne's outer western suburbs, a mess of elevated steel and concrete and drainage infrastructure that was still about 5 months out from its final pour. Julian had been the lead engineer on the drainage system since the project kicked off 18 months ago, and he knew the site the way you eventually know any place you've spent too much of your professional life. By instinct and irritation in equal measure. The Monday morning meeting ran from 8 to 9 in the site office, a demountable that smelled perpetually of instant coffee and wet cement. Julian arrived 3 minutes early, which he always did. He poured himself a coffee from the machine on the counter, not because it was good, because it wasn't, but because having a cup to put his hands around gave meetings a certain shape, and took the chair at the corner of the table where he could see the plans on the wall and everyone's faces simultaneously. Marco arrived 45 seconds later, which was also how it always went. "Right," Marco said, dropping his folder on the table and angling himself into the chair beside Julian in the way a large man occupies a chair, that particular physics of taking up exactly your fair share of space, plus a margin, which Julian understood because he operated the same way. Marco Delaney. Italian-Australian, second-generation Melbourne, heavy handshake, never met a problem he couldn't argue into submission. Julian had worked with him on 2 projects now, and trusted him the way you trusted someone who was reliably correct about half the time and willing to fight you loudly on the other half. "You look like shit," Marco said. "Good morning to you too," Julian said. "I mean it, did you sleep?" "Perfectly, I always look like this." "You don't always look like this." Marco poured himself a coffee and grimaced at it. "You owe me a beer." "Still." "From the last game, yes, still. You haven't paid it." "I didn't watch the last game." "You didn't watch it, you still owe me. Those are separate things." Phil, the project manager, arrived with the client rep, a man from the Civil Works Authority named Graham who wore high-vis over his business shirt as though he'd learned from a pamphlet that this was what construction sites required. Phil sorted his notes. Graham nodded at the room. Julian put his elbows on the table. He gave the drainage update in the crisp, quantity surveyor rhythm that 8 years of project meetings had beaten into him. Where they were, what the numbers said, what the outstanding risks were, and in what order to be worried about them. The room followed. Graham took a note. The junior engineer on secondment, a kid named Tom or Tim, Julian had already lost the name, watched Julian's hands on the table with the slightly too attentive look of someone trying to learn how it was done. It was done by knowing your subject matter completely and saying it at a pace that communicated exactly that. Julian had learned this early, and he'd never unlearned it. He stood up at one point to point at a section of the wall plans, drainage grades on the southern approach, a detail Graham wanted to see in context, and as he reached forward his shirt pulled again, the same catch across the back between the shoulder blades, the same subtle wrongness. He tugged it flat with one hand while he pointed with the other. Marco didn't notice. Graham didn't notice. He moved on. After the meeting, Marco fell into step beside him in the car park. "How are you actually?" Marco said, which was different from the opening gambit in the meeting. Marco had 2 modes, banter and sincerity, and you could tell which one you were getting by the absence of a joke. "Getting there," Julian said. Marco nodded. Don't push it, he understood. He didn't push it. Julian had been getting there since October. Since the call from the hospital that he'd almost missed because he was on site and his phone was in the office, and by the time he got to his mother's ward, she was unconscious and he stood in the doorway for a while and then came in and sat down next to her and held her hand, and she hadn't woken up. She'd had things to tell him. He knew that because she'd tried twice in the week before and lost the thread each time, and he'd told himself it was the morphine, and he was still not entirely sure it was the morphine. 6 months, he was getting there. The commute home was 40 minutes of the M80 in Crawland release traffic, which was the specific irony of being the engineer on a road project that still couldn't root around itself. Julian sat with his hands loose on the wheel, radio on a station, playing something he wasn't listening to, and watched the interchange he designed loom up over the on-ramp and recede in the mirror. He sat slightly further from the wheel than usual. He noticed this and adjusted, sat up straight, shifted his seat forward slightly, and the moment passed. He put it down to tiredness. The supermarket was an automatic stop. He needed coffee and something for dinner, and he walked the produce aisle with the barely conscious efficiency of a man for whom grocery shopping was infrastructure management rather than pleasure. Bread, milk, something for dinner. He was thinking about the drainage calculations and not much else. He stopped at the herbs. Fresh coriander. He picked up a bunch without deciding to, the way you pick something up when your hands are moving independently of your intentions. He stood in the supermarket fluorescence with the coriander in one hand and the basket in the other, and looked at it. He wasn't much of a cook. He'd established this fact about himself at 23 when he moved out of the family home and discovered that his repertoire, without his mother's quiet kitchen as backup, consisted mostly of pasta with jarred sauce and the occasional roast chicken on Sundays when he had the energy to attempt something with a tray. He didn't buy fresh herbs. He didn't know what he intended to do with fresh coriander on a Monday evening. He bought it anyway. At the checkout, he looked at it again, the bunch sitting at the top of his basket between the coffee and the half-dozen eggs, and had no clearer answer. He paid for it and put it in his bag. The apartment was on the third floor of a red brick block in Coburg that Julian had moved into 6 months ago, in the week after the funeral, when his old flat had suddenly felt like the wrong size in a way he couldn't articulate. He'd needed somewhere new, somewhere that didn't have him in it from before. He hadn't entirely achieved this. The furniture was mostly from the old place, the boxes he'd moved were mostly still boxes, and there was a specific quality to the rooms, the way they held objects without holding him, that suggested a person who'd moved in without finishing the act. He was aware of this and had not done anything about it, which was its own kind of statement. He cooked something with the coriander. He didn't know why the dish was better for it, only that it was, a note underneath the main flavor, fresh and slightly sharp, that hadn't been there before. He stood at the bench and ate it and thought, briefly, I should do that again, and then moved on. He made coffee. Good filter coffee, the one thing he'd gotten serious about in his early 20s and hadn't let slip. A proper grinder, decent beans, the small ritual of it that was genuinely his own rather than inherited. He poured a cup and stood at the kitchen bench with both hands around it. He stopped. There was something in the apartment. Not a sound, not anything so definable. More like a quality to the air, a warmth underneath the coffee smell that was almost familiar in the way half-remembered things are familiar. Present at the edge of recognition, not quite coming forward. He stood there and breathed it in and tried to identify it the way you try to identify a word that keeps slipping away, and it didn't come to him. He stood there for maybe 30 seconds before letting it go. He took his coffee to the couch. He turned on the television. Something was on, a documentary about something. He registered the visual field of it, but not the content. The couch was comfortable, and the apartment was quiet, and he drank his coffee and watched without watching. On the shelf above the television, there was a photograph. He'd put it there the night he moved in because it was the first thing he'd unpacked from the box labeled Bedroom Misc. And it needed somewhere to go, and the shelf was obvious. Elena at maybe 40, in a garden he recognized as his Aunt Franca's place in Reservoir, that overgrown bougainvillea in the background, the sun coming from the right angle to catch everything in gold. She was laughing at something off camera, head slightly tilted, her copper-red hair bright in the light. She looked the way she'd always looked in good photographs, like someone caught in the middle of being happy, the moment before the self-consciousness set in. He didn't usually look at it. He'd put it there, and then successfully not looked at it for 6 months, which was a skill he hadn't known he possessed until he needed it. He looked at it now. He didn't know why he kept looking. He wasn't thinking anything in particular, nothing was arriving in words, just the photograph, his eyes on it, the specific quality of the angle of her face. The cheekbones, her hair in the light, the way she was tilted toward whatever was making her laugh, that instinctive lean into the world that had been one of her most recognizable physical signatures. He'd always thought of himself as his father's kid. Derek's build, Derek's bluntness, Derek's particular relationship with silence. His mother had been the one who talked, who laughed at her own jokes, who made the house smell like coffee and whatever she was cooking. He'd received her warmth and reflected it differently, the way you receive a wavelength of light and send it back at a different frequency. Her hair, though, he hadn't inherited her hair. His was brown going gray at the temple, ordinary Derek's hair. Copper red had skipped him entirely. He looked away from the photograph. He finished his coffee. He got up and took the cup to the kitchen sink and caught, peripherally, his own reflection in the dark kitchen window, just a flash of it, the shape of him in the glass, and there was a moment, brief and specific, where the shape didn't resolve in quite the way he expected. He blinked. The reflection was just him. He rinsed the cup. He went to bed. He didn't sleep well anymore. This was established fact since October, logged in the part of his brain where he filed problems that don't have useful solutions, which was a drawer he preferred not to open. The apartment was too quiet. His old flat had been in Fitzroy, above a bar, and there had been a specific texture to the noise of it, not loud, just present, the background hum of a building that was occupied and commercial and alive. This place was residential quiet. The particular absence of people doing things. He lay on his back in the dark and listened to it. The house he'd grown up in had never sounded like this. Even at 2 a.m, with his parents asleep, there had been the sound of the house itself, the tick of the radiator, his mother's particular pattern of moving through the kitchen in the early morning when she couldn't sleep, which he'd absorbed so thoroughly that he could have identified it in an audio lineup. The weight of another person present somewhere. The baseline of not being alone in a building. He drifted eventually. The dreams didn't resolve into images, they were more like spaces, rooms with texture and temperature, the feeling of somewhere he almost recognized but couldn't quite name. Warm. The light had a quality to it, amber-edged, the specific color of afternoon sun through curtains. Someone else had lived in these rooms before him. He moved through them without urgency, attending to nothing particular. He woke at 3:14 a.m. He lay still for a moment, listening. Nothing. The apartment was perfectly quiet, street below it equally quiet, no sound to explain the waking. He lay there for a while with his eyes open in the dark, and then his body made the decision he hadn't. His breathing slowed, his shoulders released, and he was gone again. The rooms were still there when he went back. The amber light, the warmth underneath everything. He moved through them without fear. In the morning, he would not remember any of it. He would get up at 6:15 and shower and open the wardrobe, and the shirt would pull across his shoulders, and he would put it down to the wash cycle and lace his boots tighter and go to work. The afternoon would happen, and the supermarket would happen, and the coffee, and the kitchen, and the photograph, and the shape in the dark window, and none of it would aggregate into anything he'd think to give a name. But the apartment was warmer than it had been. He slept. And that's chapter 1 of the Bloodline debt. Julian got dressed. He went to work. He bought coriander he didn't plan to buy and couldn't explain. Nothing happened, except everything already started. That's what this story does. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly rearranges the furniture while you're looking the other way. And by the time you notice, something essential has already shifted. If you need to know where this goes, and I promise you, you do, the full 13 chapters are already waiting for you over on our Patreon and Subscribestar. The whole thing, beginning to end, completely free. Links in the show notes. And while you're down there, hit like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment. I want to know, did you feel it? That first moment where something was just slightly off because Julian didn't, not yet. Thanks for listening to EvoFem Tales.